It's been quite a week for UK politics.
Indeed, with a reshuffle that I don't think people really, they knew the reshuffle was coming at some point, but the timing took lots of people by surprise.
They're never interesting. Apart from this one, there was like this in the newsroom, there was this sort of collective. I mean, you don't get those moany moments and go, what?
Well, there was when
back.
David Cameron appeared out of his Range Rover in Downing Street, and it seemed from Twitter that everyone had a collective kind of second check, like rubbing their eyes, am I seeing things correctly? And it's really pertinent, David Cameron's appointment, isn't it, for the summit that took place between Xi and Biden last night. He's the epitome in the United Kingdom of that attempt in the 2010 onwards period of trying to economically engage more with China.
They pulled some points in the pub,
There was that famous pub visit.
Yeah, it's like the Orcs pub visit.
And now here we are in 2023 when so much has changed.
But what was the appointment about? Is it about just getting a heavyweight in the cabinet, or is it really about foreign policy and trying to get closer to China?
I don't think it's the latter about China, but I think my understanding is that in the time, recently in the last month, is it now 5 weeks since Israel and Hamas have been in conflict, Rishi Sunak has, very often what happens with prime ministers is they do get former prime ministers on the phone quite a lot. It's quite interesting quite how much, it doesn't really matter which party they are. They'll get people. I remember Boris Johnson would get Tony Blair on the phone during COVID and so on. So it's quite habitual for former leaders to want to help. And my understanding is that Rishi Sunak was talking a lot to David Cameron because he does have insight both into the Israeli side of politics, but also to the Gulf and the Arab side of things. It does have the advantage, lots of people have written this, I think it's true, it does have the advantage that going into an election 12, 14 months, Sunak can do more concentration on domestic politics.
I guess the danger is as long as he can keep David Cameron under control.
Yeah, there's a power.
This is another podcast, isn't it? Welcome to In the City, Bloomberg's podcast connecting you to the conversations and the stories shaping the world of finance. I'm Francine Lacqua in our London studio with David Merritt and Allegra Stratton.
And so this week, after the Biden-Xi meeting, we want to find out where things stand between the world's biggest economies and also connect the dots a little bit with events here in the UK. The surprise appointment of David Cameron, key of the golden age between Britain and China, what that means in terms of the relationship with Britain and the world's second biggest economy.
So with us from DC, Jennifer Welch, chief economic analyst at Bloomberg Economics. Before Bloomberg, she spent nearly 8 years as an analyst for the government, including on the National Security Council as a director for China and Taiwan. So Jennifer, you understand this, and you've also come back fresh off a plane because you were at the meeting where President Xi and President Biden were meeting.
Fresh off the plane from San Francisco, still in the airport lounge. And I think both leaders can leave this meeting saying it was a success for them. I think from President Biden's perspective, he achieved consensus on many of his main items going into it, in particular, agreement to cooperate on stemming fentanyl flows to the U.S., reopening military-to-military channels, establishing a working group to discuss artificial intelligence. And as he reiterated multiple times throughout his press conference last night, a commitment to pick up the phone if the other leader needed to talk. I think from Xi's perspective, his main goal going into the meeting was to project stability in U.S.-China ties as part of a broader effort to reassure investors, and in particular foreign investors and businesses, that China is open for business. It's a good business environment for them still. And that seemed to be a message he was projecting not only throughout the meeting, but also at the dinner he attended last night with a number of American CEOs and investors.
So Jennifer, you're used to how these things work, and obviously they're very finely choreographed every sort of moment, the messages. So when you say it's a success, does that mean it was just, the script that everyone came armed with was delivered, or were there any breakthroughs that perhaps surprised people in terms of, thawing of relations? I mean, the only sort of unscripted moment seems to be this moment when Joe Biden said he still thinks Xi is a dictator. I mean, which is obviously, hopefully not, or potentially not planned. Was there anything that was kind of off script that could be counted as a win here?
I think so. Largely speaking, just to take a step back, yeah, most of these agreements were probably reached in advance of the meeting to ensure that they could walk out with an agreement on what specifically they had discussed and what specifically they had agreed to. So all of that was probably negotiated in advance. The other items that they discussed but didn't come to an agreement on, the many other bilateral and global issues, they probably also agreed in advance. We're going to discuss these things. They probably realized they weren't going to come to a consensus on it. I think some of the things that, from my perspective, were probably more organic to the moment were the interactions between the two leaders, in particular, when President Biden came out to greet President Xi. And then it sounds like at some point during the meeting, President Biden handed President Xi a photo of Xi when he had visited San Francisco back in the 80s. And that was something that Xi apparently found very touching. He talked about this at the CEO dinner last night. And then the other piece that, again, she seemed to really find to be an important signal towards him of respect was when President Biden walked him out and they took a few minutes and were chatting by Xi Jinping's car about the car and I think more broadly just trying to establish more of a rapport. Those moments were probably not scripted, and it seemed like Xi Jinping might have even been slightly surprised by them.
So it's a little bit warmer then, you reckon? Like,
yeah.
Do you think a takeaway is actually they sort of get on a bit better than leaders of two countries that have been slinging so much mud around the last year should be getting on?
My sense of this is that President Biden has, I mean, to say he has deep foreign policy expertise would be an understatement. He is decades of experience in this realm, and he is really a very skilled diplomat. I think a lot of this was his initiative, thinking through how to establish a rapport with this other leader, even though the Biden administration views China as a chief rival. I think President Biden has put an emphasis on still having a relationship with Xi that allows them to be able to work together when necessary. And I see a lot of President Biden's sort of fingerprints on this and his thinking through of how to establish that rapport. Candidly, I don't think it's, and this goes back to the question earlier about his comments about Xi being a dictator. I wouldn't think of this as necessarily he has necessarily warm feelings towards Xi Jinping so much as this is someone he has to have a working relationship with for the sake of both of their countries. I think there are a lot of things that he disagrees with Xi about, and obviously they have very different approaches to leadership. And President Biden is a strong believer in democracy and democratic values. So I wouldn't see this necessarily as him trying to court Xi out of admiration for him so much as his feeling that it's important that they be able to work together for the sake of both their countries.
Jennifer, can I just ask you, when you talked, it's really interesting to hear you say he had deep diplomatic skills, which I completely agree with from here in London. But when you look at the comments he makes at the end of that press conference about China being a dictatorship, and then you see the cutaway of Blinken rolling his eyes and kind of looking heavenward,
sort of facepalm.
But the sort of the observation, the other facepalm, yeah. The observation I have, and I wonder what you think, is it didn't seem to me like Biden misspoke. And we have a saying in the UK that a gaffe is often a moment of honesty that people aren't supposed to say, rather than necessarily saying the completely the wrong thing. So I just wonder what your take is on Biden and whether actually in that moment he was courting, the bits of America that are really concerned and worried about China and was trying to have it both ways, or whether it was deeply unfortunate and Blinken kind of looking in despair was actually nearer the truth of it.
No, I think your first hypothesis is probably right. I think this is a genuine reflection of President Biden's worldview. And at the beginning of his administration, he was especially very clear about the global challenges facing democracies. And that's really kind of carried through. And you see it in how he talks about Russia and China. You see it in how he talks about Ukraine and other conflicts around the world. And it's not the first time he's referred to Xi as this. I think he did take the question, even though his press conference was technically over. He did still take a moment to answer the question. And yes, part of the calculus might have been, one, this is his genuine worldview, and in case people are confused, he wants to make that clear. And then two, to your point, there is often a danger that people will overinterpret these sorts of meetings and think that the United States is courting China or is looking the other way when it comes to China's human rights abuses. And this might have been him taking the opportunity to clarify where he is on those things. Because again, I do think, having heard him talk about this and having heard him talk about it, especially when it comes to these rivals, I think it's something that means genuinely quite a lot to him and is a really important part of how he views the world.
Was it surprising, Jennifer, that China didn't react more to that? And again, I mean, I can't imagine really being like a Secretary of State, but, having gone through, I guess, the briefing with your boss and then hear something like that.
Well, I was used to work for Boris, right? I mean, it feels a bit like that, where you're like 95% of your way through the event, and then you're like, oh my goodness me, the thing he's not supposed, though I think we're all agreeing that actually Biden, intentionally spoke. Yeah. But, you get all the way through this event, and it's so interesting you say, Jennifer, it was sort of, he didn't need to take that question. And I remember that feeling as well of like, why did he just randomly take an extra question? It was going so well up until that point.
But what happens afterwards? Do you actually tell the leader, like,
you have a kind of small, it's all kind of gloriously shambolic, certainly in the United Kingdom, where you have a small kind of debrief huddle, and the principal, as they're known inside government, in my case, it would have been Boris, they will just say, oh, well, you can tidy that up, right? And they go off to the next meeting.
And you probably have like 5 people on the phone just to make sure, how is the other side reacting to this?
Doing the tidying up. And
Jennifer, and for the moment, like, China seems to have reacted okay, or they're largely ignoring it.
Yeah, we're not seeing anything in terms of the public reaction. Certainly when you contrast it with when he had made the comments earlier this summer as well, and there was more of a stronger public reaction to it. We haven't seen that yet. And in fact, Xi Jinping gave a major speech to this business dinner last night, and still was reflecting very warm feelings coming out of that meeting, and talking a lot in particular about his rapport with President Biden. My guess would be that there's not really an incentive for them to play this up publicly, because she wants to portray the U.S.-China relationship as very stable.
I mean, it's so interesting, Jennifer, because just in terms of who's got the kind of upper hand here in this situation, stepping back and looking at the economic situation in China right now, there's a lot of headwinds that Xi Jinping's facing, right? And as a result, his utter dominance of politics in China, it isn't quite as secure, as it was before. You've got plunging growth, you've got a demographic problem. So he comes to San Francisco and courts business leaders in a slightly less dominant fashion, right, than we've seen in the past. We all remember the era. What did they call it when they came here?
Golden era.
The golden era under David Cameron. We
could talk about China.
Him. But the diplomats call themselves the wolf warriors, is it, coming in? And even the Queen complained about the attitude of them when they came to Britain. And now there's this feeling of coming in slightly more in supplication, is it? Because they need the economic ties, and they need the technology, and they need to rebuild these bridges in order to shore up the economy and therefore his domestic position. What was your sense, Jennifer, on the ground of those sort of power dynamics in the summit?
I think that was definitely Xi's aim going in, was to try and rebuild foreign investor and foreign business confidence in China, because that is still important for China's growth model, to have the foreign investment, have access to foreign technology, as you noted, to have that growth path forward to what he eventually wants to get to, which is more self-sufficiency, but they're not there yet. At the same time, from what we were hearing about the ticket price for that dinner last night, and in particular the ticket price to sit at the head table with Xi, and based on who turned up at the dinner, it seemed like there were plenty of businesses and investors that were extremely interested in going and meeting with him. So,
how much?
How much? We're all looking at each other.
I didn't realize you had to pay for it.
Oh, yes. So the reports were that the entrance ticket to the dinner itself was about $2,000, and it was magnitudes higher if you wanted to sit at the head table with Xi Jinping.
Who pockets the money? The White House or? Right.
Definitely not the White House. I would assume it went to the dinner hosts, who were the U.S.-China Business Council, along with a couple of other U.S.-based, organizations that are involved in kind of facilitating U.S.-China cultural and other connections. But all that is to say, like, the power dynamic might have been like slightly mixed in the sense that there are all these investors and businesses who are clearly really interested in getting close to Xi and talking with him, and who seem, by all accounts, still extremely interested in the China environment. I'm thinking about folks like Elon Musk and Tim Cook, who were seen at the dinner last night. And then at the meeting itself, yeah, I think when you look at the rap sheet of what President Biden's agenda was going into it and what Xi's agenda probably was, and then you look at the outcomes from the meeting, I mean, there are several very specific things that President Biden can point to that he got out of it. It's not quite as clear what Xi Jinping got out of it in terms of concessions, but we weren't really expecting him to. But all that is to say, to your point, yeah, it seems like the big win for Xi was just, portraying stable U.S.-China ties, which is also what President Biden wanted, but then some.
Businesses have legitimate concerns if they, do actually operate in China. I mean, I think we've seen like local protectionism, regulatory environment was pretty unpredictable. And then you have crackdowns based on national security concerns. Jennifer, has President Xi or people around him been able to allay some of those fears to make sure that foreign direct investment comes back into the country?
I don't think we're there yet. And I think part of the challenge is that foreign businesses and investors are hearing two different messages coming out of Beijing. There's the message that is relayed, as Xi did last night, quite explicitly: China is open for business, China welcomes foreign investors. And that's been relayed consistently over the past few months. But at the same time, what they are seeing in terms of actual policies is a continuation of national security concerns trumping economic concerns. And so I think from their perspective, that still leads to an uncertain environment, because you're never really sure which message is going to take prominence at that moment in time.
And to state the obvious, I mean, the UK has skin in this game, right? I mean, America and China are the first and second biggest in terms of our bilateral trade, two-way trade. But you can see it in James Cleverly, who was our foreign secretary, and now he's our home secretary. But he went to China and became the first to get to visit China in 5 years, partly because there's this kind of doublethink that loads of countries are trying to do, and we've seen it with Biden in the last 24 hours, trying to, on the one hand, demonstrate they know the need for caution for domestic political reasons, but also national security reasons. On the other hand, it is big economic fry, and so you have to keep that kind of interaction going. It is difficult politically in the UK as well as it is in America, though. You can see already the reaction to David Cameron appointment as the new foreign secretary, that concern and worry about his period 8 years ago now of a golden age in China-UK relationships, and people feeling that a lot has changed since then.
But I feel like he's also kept some ties, right, with China. And so I wonder whether...
David Cameron.
Yeah, David Cameron. And so I don't know whether...
Clearly, and I saw, was it the People's Daily or one of the Chinese newspapers controlled by the Communist Party, like they all are, celebrating his return as foreign secretary, sort of indicating warmer relations to come with Britain, teamed with this summit in San Francisco. It feels like we're in a very different place now than we were under Trump, for sure, but at least for the last few years.
Well, we are in a different position, but I think that probably happened David Cameron regardless. I think we were already inching that way with the James Cleverly visit, and obviously we saw the Chinese invited to the AI summit in the UK, what is it now, 2 weeks ago, whatever it was. But so I think we were going that way anyway, and I think if you listen to the UK government talking about it now, they're quite robust in their sort of a third way, really. That's the only way you can, it's not kind of the sort of euphoria and pub visits of Xi's visit to the UK during David Cameron's early prime ministership now around 2010, which started in 2010. But so it's not that kind of, sunlit uplands, but is also a very pragmatic, I suppose that's the key word, pragmatic sense that, we need to continue trading and interacting, but also, not just bread and butter and money. We need, on climate change, on Ukraine and AI and a host of issues, you need to engage with China.
Jennifer, what is the economic then outcome of all of this? And at Bloomberg Economics, do we see the dial moving at all with some of the thawings that we've kind of talked about and sensed this week, perhaps helped down the line with a bit more effort from the UK and maybe by down the track, perhaps the European Union? Are we going to see the global economy benefit from these sorts of big geopolitical moments?
I think that there will be a certain warming effect or confidence restoring effect that this meeting will have, given the positive vibes coming out of it. I think the only caution I would urge is that we're not seeing any fundamental shift in how these two countries are approaching each other. And in particular, it seems pretty clear President Xi went in with a message for President Biden about U.S. technological and economic policy towards China that he views as problematic. And Biden seemed to reinforce that the administration is not going to change its approach. So I don't think we're likely to see any major changes in how the U.S. actually deals with China economically or China's access to key technology. But I do think that, again, if for folks who are concerned about the trajectory of U.S.-China ties, I think this will send a reassuring signal for at least the short term. The only other thing I'd flag is I tend to be perhaps a pessimist, so I'm always looking over the horizon for dark clouds. And I keep in mind that, we had a similar vibe coming out of the two leaders meeting last year in Indonesia. And only a couple months later, things were thrown very off track by the Chinese spy balloon overflying the U.S. And beyond even another incident like that, the U.S. election is coming up, and I think domestic political pressures are going to continue to build in the U.S. to take a tougher approach to China, and that could exert its own kind of friction on the relationship.
Jennifer Welch, thank you so much. Joining us from the airport lounge.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to this week's In the City. We'll be back next week. But in the meantime, if you like our show, please head on over to wherever you listen to podcasts. Give it 5 stars, review, and subscribe. This episode was hosted by me, Francine Lacqua, David Merritt, and Allegra Stratton. It was produced by Summer Sadi, additional editing by Blake Maples. Special thanks to Jennifer Welch.